Hello everyone, this is Dave Corinth, and this is the third and final video in a series titled Making a Plane from Scratch. In the first video, sand casted the body. In the second video, we machined the body to get it ready for the final stage, which is going to be making the tote and the knob, the iron and the chip breaker, and the screw cap, and of course the fit and finish. So let's get started. So here's our body, all machined up. You can see the pinch pin is still loose. It hasn't been peened over yet. We have a piece of 1 5/8 long, 1/4 inch thick by 1 inch wide brass stock. That'll be for the screw cap. This will be the thumb screw for the screw cap. It's a knurled 1032 by 3/4 inch long thumb screw. Piece of 3 inch by 1/8 inch, 1 inch wide 01 tool steel. A piece of 2 inch long by 1/16 of an inch by 1 inch 01 tool steel for the chip breaker. 2 pieces of 632 all thread, and then a 1/4 inch diameter brass rod for the barrel nuts. For this project, we're going to use Bolivian rosewood that has some sapwood. And we want to make sure the knob matches. So I found a piece that has the sapwood in it as well. To make the barrel nuts, first I square off one end of the brass rod. I then use this countersink to find the center, prepare it for a drill bit. And you can see I have tape on there to tell me when to stop. Next, I take this 632 bottom tap and slowly turn it on the lathe and then reverse it and back it off. And then I cut it off, flip it over, and square the top of it. I use this jig I made to ensure that when I cut the slot for the top of the barrel nut, that it's centered on that barrel nut. Stanley barrel nuts are not flat on top. They have a slight camber to them. So to make that camber, I put the barrel nut in the drill press and then use a file to round it over and then finish it off with sandpaper. And you can see there's a slight camber. I marked out several totes on that piece of rosewood, but here I'm only going to show you the one that we're cutting out for this plane that has that rosewood on the bottom. Before I take these totes to the router, I want to make sure that there are no bandsaw marks on there whatsoever. So I use this file to clean it up. I use a 1/4 inch roundover bit to make these totes. And the little router table that I have is actually a Porter cable trim router turned upside down in a box to make a small router table. But it keeps my fingers away from that bit. I use a 1/4 inch Forstner bit to drill the hole for the barrel nut on the top of the tote. I then follow that up with a 3/16 brad point drill bit. Using a brad point drill bit at high speed prevents that from wandering inside that tote. I then flip it over and meet that hole from the underside. This is the way Stanley did it, and it works great. Here I'm drilling the hole for the nib that's on the casting of the plane that keeps the tote from rocking side to side once it's tightened down. Once I have the tote roughly made, I'll test fit it and make sure it goes on there nice and easy. You don't want to have to force that screw down. The knobs for this little plane is going to be a little over 1 1/8 inches tall. And I always make 2 at a time, so in case I screw one of them up, I got a backup. And I use my mini lathe to do this. I mark out some critical points, and then those that represent the high and the low spots on the knob. I turn each one of these by hand, one at a time. I don't have a template that I follow. I've done enough of these that it's almost muscle memory. I use the same Forstner bit and brad point drill bit that I used on the Tote for this knob. And I test fit the knob as well, making sure that it goes on easy. Don't have to force it on. I use 01 tool steel to make the irons for these planes. And when I get it, it's annealed, so it's soft enough that I can machine it. Here I'm using a carbide 3/8 inch end mill to cut the hole at the bottom. I then switch to a 3/16 bit and cut the slot from that hole towards the top of the iron. I learned the hard way, if you go too fast and try to make too deep of a cut, you will break one of those bits. Next, we're going to cut the ears off the top of the iron. And of course I do this on my end mill. The angle on this is 12 degrees. And the end mill makes pretty quick work of it. A lot easier than a grinder and a lot more accurate. And you get a better finish when you're done. Once I'm done with this side, I'll flip it over and do the exact same thing to the other side. It's starting to look like an iron. To cut the angle on the cutting edge, I go back to my end mill. I do about 90% of this angle on the end mill, and then I'll finish it off on a grinder. But since it's soft, it goes a lot faster right now. After it's heat treated, it takes a lot longer to cut that angle. To make the chip breaker, I have this pattern with the hole right where I want it. I then place it on top, hit it with a punch, same place every time. A chip breaker has two purposes. One is to obviously break the chip as it comes through the mouth, and the other is to put the iron in tension. And to do that, you have to bend the end of it just a little bit. Here I use an old vise. I clamp it in there, and with a wood block that has a 4-degree bevel on the end of it, I smack it with a ball peen hammer, and it makes a perfect 4-degree angle on the end of that chip breaker. I forgot to hit record when I did this the first time, so here I'm just going through the motions so you can see the process. I machined the edge of the chip breaker on my end mill as well. This won't get hardened, but it's still easier to do it on this end mill. And it's really accurate. Here I'm tapping the hole for the chip breaker screw. It's 16th inch steel, so it's not too difficult to tap, but you do have to make sure that it is perpendicular to the chip breaker. The tops of these screws are not flat when I get them, so I machine the top flat before I put the slot in it. And just like the barrel nuts, I made a jig to make sure I cut that slot in the center of this chip breaker screw. Once I have the iron and the chip breaker machined, I'll test fit them to make sure they line up right and they work as they should. Now, of course, that screw is too tall right now and it'll have to get cut off. But it works like it should. Before I sent this to get heat treated, I stamped the logo in the top of the iron. I wouldn't be able to do this after the heat treat. One good whack and the logo's in there. I have a template for the screw cap with all the essential markings on it. And just like the chip breaker, I use a punch to find that hole for the thumb screw on top. Next I cut the slot pinch pin. The pinch pin is 1/8 of an inch in diameter, so I want this groove to go down 1/6 into the screw cap, or 1/2 the thickness of the pinch pin. This is a ball tail end mill, 1/8 of an inch, and it works perfect for this. I used to cut these by hand with a rat tail file, and this is a lot faster. The sides of the screw cap have an OG profile, and I use a 1/2 inch end mill bit to cut that profile. Next, I'll drill the hole on top of the screw cap that'll take that thumb screw. It'll be tapped with a 1032 tap. To make the radius on top of the screw cap, I use my sanding center once again, and it's actually beveled at 2 degrees. Once I get everything machined and the iron's back from heat treat, I'll assemble the iron to the chip breaker, and then I want to test fit everything in the plane to make sure it fits like it should. I don't want there to be a large gap between the chip breaker and the screw cap, and I don't want the barrel nut for the tote to hit the iron. Next, I want to form that radius on the end of the screw cap. And I form this radius by hand at my sanding center. Here I'm filing off those sharp points on the end of the screw cap. Here I'm peening the pinch pin in place. Because I have this sped up 3 times faster, it looks like I'm really whacking it, but I'm not. You don't want to hit this too hard, you will bend that pinch pin. So here everything's made. We have the tote, the knob, the chip breaker screw, iron, rods and barrel nuts, screw cap, and the screw cap thumb screw. So this is the most tedious and probably the most important stage of making this plane, is the fit and finish. First, I'll lap the sides to get that pinch pin flush with the sides. And next, I'll lap the sole, removing all those machining marks. I use 220 grit sandpaper here, and that's plenty fine for this. I don't leave the paint on the top of the rails and the sides. I remove it. To do that, I use sandpaper. And no, my hands don't sand that fast. This is obviously sped up. Once that's done, I'll use Scotch-Brite to polish everything up. The screw cap gets lapped as well, It's important that it's flat, at least on the leading edge where it makes contact with the chip breaker. The top of the screw cap gets the same treatment. This kind of refines that edge that was made over at the sanding center. All the other machining marks have to be removed as well. And once that's done, we put it on some Scotch-Brite to polish everything up. Scotch-Brite really makes brass look good. I also clean up the sides of the iron as well. This removes those machining marks made earlier. When the iron comes back from heat treat, it's kind of discolored. So I'll dry sand it with some 220 to remove that. Next, I'll do the same thing, but this time with some oil. The finish I use for the Tote and Knob is lacquer. Once that's dried sufficiently, I'll take some 4/0 steel wool, polish it up. And then I'll buff it by hand. And the knob gets the exact same treatment. Since one half of the cutting edge is the back of the iron, it's important that it's flat. And I use these diamond plates to do that. I start with 320 and finish it at 1200 before I go to the water stones. The primary angle on the cutting edge is 25 degrees. I add a 5-degree secondary hone to that. Stanley, as well as a handful of other manufacturers, used to blue the back of the chip breaker, and I like to put that on these little planes. Once the blue is applied, I'll spray some oil on it to prevent it from rusting. Next, I'll want to lap the chip breaker where it makes contact with the iron. The last step prior to getting the plane finally assembled is to wax everything. Once the wax has had a chance to dry for about 15 minutes, I take a cotton cloth and polish everything up. For a small plane, these things work surprisingly well. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and how I make a plane from scratch through the other two videos. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll make more. Thank you for watching.